Thank you for that. It's a blessing that we often overlook unless it's a couple of holidays a year, but help us always to remember that by your grace we have freedoms to be able to live and to do. And we hope that we're using that freedom in a way that would spread the gospel, that we can be active in our communities, that we can influence others, teach them the gospel, that they too can live with you for eternity. We're thankful for Bible class, the additional time that we have to look into your word and try to apply it to our lives, that we may draw closer to you, that we remember all the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, we'll move into a different section of our study. As you know, we've gone through different pictures that the Bible would talk that relate to our influence. We've talked about salt and light and epistles and leaven. And now we're going to be pretty practical. Now we're going to take that influence that we're talking about and put it in a specific place. And so this morning, we're going to be talking about a Christian's influence in the community. If a person is even remotely normal, and we'll use those terms lightly, but even if they're remotely normal, they live within some type of community. They're surrounded by and interact with people. There truly aren't that many hermits that exist on the earth. We were created to be with others. Don't you remember when Adam was created? What did God say? God said that it's not good that man is alone. Reminds me of that show, Alone, right? Where they drop them out on this island. They survive as far as they can, as long as they can, as many days as they can. And most of them, the winner of the entire competition is only isolated for 2 months or so. I think 70 days is about how long the winner comes out to be. And some of those folks get crazy. They can't handle silence and not having interaction with mankind. They miss their family, they miss their girlfriend, they miss their husband, and they just tap out. I got to go back and be around people. Well, we're made to be social beings. Proverbs 18:1 tells us that it's just the opposite. It said, a man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment. We were not created to live on an island, even though we want to retreat there sometimes. That's fine. Proverbs 27:17, very familiar to men's meetings and men's days. Iron sharpens iron. And what does that mean? Well, in order for that to happen, I'll finish the rest of the verse. So a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. Well, in order for that to happen, there has to be contact. The iron sharpening iron, there has to be a striking blow. And so there is with our friendships. We have to have contact. John 17:15, in prayer that Jesus was making, he said, I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them in the world. So he knew that we were going to be operating in this system, even among those that are evil. He said that you should keep them from the evil one. So Jesus knows that we have to be around other people to be able to convert them. 1 Corinthians 5:9 and 10. I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. So Paul was even writing to the Corinthians, look, you're surrounded by some bad stuff, but you still have to be in the middle of them to make a difference. And then 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. Well, you can't stay in that company. That can't be the company that you prefer, because then the rubbing off, so to speak, is the bad on the good, not the good on the bad. We need to be aware of influence of the community, but we cannot avoid it altogether. And Jesus was not this way, right? How many times was he accused of eating with the publicans and the sinners? And there are several times throughout the New Testament, in just the brief period that we have recorded of Jesus' life, where he's in people's homes. He's out in public teaching. He is a social being. Luke 2:52 is kind of a summary of the whole progressive nature of his life. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. He covered all the bases. Well, how did he do that? He had to interact with man. John 2:1 through 11, right? He attended a social function. Jesus was at a wedding. In Luke 19:1 through 10, he went to dinner at Zacchaeus' house. There were other party guests that were there. If you'll excuse the expression, he would hang out with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so he was social. He would show us all those things. Now, did he sin? No. So is it possible for us to engage in social situations without sinning? Yes. And we should seek to do those things because of our Christian influence. So here's the first point today, that when we're thinking about being influenced in our community, says I'm on. You got me today? But there's things that we must know and practice. You can go out and be an influence, and we talked about that being good or bad. And so there are things that we must know if we're going to go out into our communities and be a Christian influence, that we must practice what we preach. And I know that that's a saying that we often use, but you think about it. We come in here and we hear from God's word, and there's instructions and given, and maybe I'm creative enough to have application for you to motivate you to want to do that in the coming week. And then we leave all of that behind. That we live after ourselves, or we live like the world, then we ruin our Christian influence. You know, there was a story of a man who owned a restaurant, a Christian man that owned a restaurant, but he wouldn't close it down on Sundays. He would leave it open. He would work shifts in there on Sundays and stuff, and he thinks he's trying to do the right thing. There's times that he would engage some of his customers in religious conversations, and some of them, you know, it was inevitable that would come up and said, man, if it's so important to you, why aren't you there? Practice what you preach. You know, we couldn't be a restaurant owner and be open on Sundays and then try to talk to our patrons about going to church. If we're trying to win others to Christ, being here matters. You know, why would you get someone to come here all the time if you don't go all the time? People see it, and it will affect the way that they think about religion. People don't practice what they preach. And then they think that that gives them the excuse. That's my get out of jail free card. Like, you're asking me to do something that nobody else does. Well, with a Christian, we have to be able to show that. I pray all of the time that we have to miss things in the community to gather here for worship. You pray for that? I do. I do, because I know in my own life when I was having to miss things, whether they be extracurricular at work, or they be awards or things like that, awards banquets, or if they're concerts, or if they're practices for our kids, or even games for our kids. I prayed that we would have those things come up to where we had to say no to that, to tell them we've had an appointment with the Lord long before we signed up for baseball, or whatever the case may be. Because people take notice of that. You know, my brother-in-law and his cousin, his first cousin, both of them played football for Gregory Portland High School. And they would leave practice early on Wednesdays to attend services. Well, Coach didn't like that, right? Because all the rest of the boys are out there practicing. So he would make them, when they came back to practice on Thursday, start their practice running bear crawls. He would punish them. And did that for a number of years. Well, there was a coach that watched those two boys gladly go through that, and they never changed their mind about it. They never stayed on Wednesday to avoid the bear crawls. They always did them. That he changed their policy that they let out in time for any of the boys on the team to go to church. That's Christian influence. That's practicing what we preach. That's right. In Jackson, Mississippi, I don't know if it's still that way, but recently, a few years ago, they never had a practice or a game on Wednesday nights, and they didn't play on Sundays. If more Christians would be exerting their influence on those things, then that's what we would do. We would play on Thursdays. We would play on Fridays and Saturdays. The tournaments would be Fridays and Saturdays, not Saturdays and Sundays. And so that's exactly some of the stuff that we're talking about. Even the modest dress, what they're allowing or forcing in cheerleading and women's volleyball, and even in men's sports where those men aren't dressed modestly. The Christians aren't standing up. They're coming back into the church house and trying to defend why their daughters and sons are immodestly dressed in competition. And it should be the other way around. So that was the missing the ball games, charity functions. I wrote awards banquets. Community needs to know that we value worshiping God and being with the brethren above all of the secular activities. And maybe we get them to change their mind about their calendars. It can happen. We must walk the walk. The former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began to both do and teach. That was the first line of what Matthew wrote to this nobleman, Theophilus. What was he talking about? He was talking about his influence in the community. I'm going to write the account of what Jesus said and did to you. I'm going to tell you about his influence. The most common argument slammed against the church is they're just a bunch of hypocrites, right? Don't you hear that with people that have given up on what they call organized religion? Well, if it's organized by man, I don't blame you. But if the religion was organized by God and those people are attempting to follow the pattern of the New Testament, then you don't have any excuse, because I'll ask you this question. If there are people that haven't quite got down, I practice what I preach, where would you want them to be? Where would you want them to be? In the church, learning, growing, loving, serving. So that's what I always tell them. There's just a bunch of hypocrites. And I always ask them, where would you want them to be? They're not going to tell me a ball game or awards banquet. Yeah. What they're saying is how I live doesn't matter at all to anybody, anywhere. Do what you want. Well, that's hedonism. That's not Christianity. But we have control of that, right? Now let's flip it back on the other side and take care of the real part of it. We have control over that. We don't have to be a hypocrite. We can study our Bibles. We can be engaged in prayer. We can serve those that are in our communities, and they're able to see, well, wow, he's not a hypocrite. She really does care about other souls and is living out the mission of Jesus Christ. And so that can be our answer as well. Yep. Look, and so that was a constant reminder for him every day. What hurts the Church of Christ in the religion of Christendom is all these guys that are going to put that fish and that cross and that heart on their business card, and then they go out into public and they don't give honest quotes and they don't finish the job, and they're not faithful to their work, right? And what they're doing is they are spreading a bad influence, even though they're going to teach them false doctrines if they came in, but they're claiming these things. And that's how people are influencing in the community in a Christian type way. We have to be able to back up what we say. We can pray at restaurants, we can pray at ball games, we can do all these things that we do, but if we don't back it up with the way that we live, it doesn't matter. 1 Peter 3:16 talks about having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. He said they're going to try to tear you down. They're going to try to say that there's hypocrites in the church. They're going to try to say that organized religion is a scam and those people really don't care. But Peter said you live in such a way that even if they do try to defame your good conduct, it's not going to stick because of the person that you are. It was happening in Paul's day too, was it not? I'm thinking of Romans 2:21. He said, you therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? So it's always been a temptation of man to hear all these things about the way that he should live, and then somehow convince himself that this thing, or that thing is really not that big of a deal. We're all human. We all sin, right? You've heard people talk about no one's perfect. Yeah, but that's not what the goal was. It's that you're striving to be perfect, and in the Bible, meaning mature or complete. That's what counts. So just because I'm not perfect doesn't mean I give up. You guys have heard me say it before. If you have a flat tire out on the road, you don't go, oh man, I got a flat tire, my whole car's ruined, and go slash the other three. No, you switch out to the spare and you try to make it and get that corrected. Well, it's the same with our lives. Just because we make a mistake doesn't mean we slash the other three tires. There's a great warning to say and not do. But woe to you, scribes, Jesus would say, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Matthew 23:13. He said, you're not showing or doing. You stand out here and you're supposed to be the ones that teach the law, but you're not doing it yourself. Well, you're not going to be saved, and you're not the right kind of example to the people you are trying to save. All of this having to do with the Christian's influence in the community. If we want someone to see what Christ can do for them, we have to show them what Christ has done for us. That has to be daily. The more consistent we are, the more uncompromising we are in stands that are against sinful things and do it in a loving way, but the more consistent we are in those things, the more influential you'll be. We must be friendly. Proverbs 18:24, a man who has friends must himself be friendly. We're thinking, well, that's pretty simple. Yeah, Proverbs is full of those simple things. But do we internalize that? Is that who we are? Friendly. When you're rude to someone in the community, how many people do you think know about it? Have you ever thought about it that way? That you were rude to one person. Let's just say that it was the cashier at H-E-B. Is she the only person that knows about it? What do you think? When she gets home and her husband says, honey, how was your day? What do you think she says? It was going good until this guy came through my line, right? We need to think about those things. There is nothing that we do that is isolated or in secret when we're in the community. We need to be kind even when we're frustrated, whether that be with a server or a cashier or an inspector, a police officer, right? Those are the two that I think about my own past. The home inspector's trying to sell a home or whatever, or maybe you're negotiating with another party to sell your home. And there's things that can frustrate you, and there's things that could make you ugly to them, to where we just need to step back just for a second. Hey, look, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? The price of a house? We'd say no. Then don't act like it. When we're rude to somebody, other people know. The police officer just pulled me over. If I'm guilty, I'm guilty. If I broke the law, then you take the penalty. There's no reason for us to be ugly or to try to fight with them, but I see it time and time and time again. You know, people want to make these reels. I don't know how many of them are fake or how many of them are real, but they're just so unkind to somebody that pulled them over when they were breaking the law. You don't want to get pulled over, don't break the law. Yeah. You're talking about like just the solicitors and marketing calls and things like that? Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah. It is, right? It is all part of being an influence in the community, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to protect it. I even put in here a neighbor whose dog goes in my yard all the time. There has to be a good way to be able to take care of that, right? And it should never be that we're, I can remember one time, I'm going to tell on Katie, don't tell her that I told y'all this, but we had some neighbors one time when we were first married, and they went out in their backyard and they would smoke cigarettes, but they would put the butts out and they would throw them into our yard. I don't know why. And so we would go out there, and we've got kids that were 5 and 3 and a baby. And here's all these cigarette butts in this pile in our yard. Well, she put them in a Ziploc bag and just threw them back over the fence. I don't know how I feel about that. We had a fine relationship with them, and no more butts came over the fence. But sometimes we just need to be able to make sure that we're resolving things that are in a way that we could always go knock on that door and say, would you like to know more about the church? That's what I want you to get from this. In all of your interactions at H-E-B and at Walmart and at our jobs and at stoplights, whatever the case may be, that's your test. When you leave that transaction, could someone say to you, hey, go ask them for a Bible study. And if I have not acted accordingly, I would say, no way. No way. Why? Because they would think you're a hypocrite, right? It's full circle for us. We must be friendly. Being a snob or being rude are big bushels that you're hiding your candle under. And we can't do that. We must take pride in the community. Romans 13, 1 through 7, right? It's a little passage that is talking about being subject to the government authorities. Their laws, the ordinances that we have within our community, some of them we may not like. Okay, then you need to work to be able to have those changed, go through the proper channels. But they're here for good. That's what Paul wrote through inspiration. He said the government is here for good. He didn't say, if you like the donkey, if you like the elephant, because the people in this room, we like the lamb, right? So this is the way that you should see government. God said that they're there for good, and you need to pay your taxes. That's Romans 13, 1 through 7. You can read it for yourself. We should have a well-kept yard and clean homes. What? There's no law for that. Well, there are ordinances for that. You know that. We should follow traffic signs and laws. We should not litter around town. We should not trash our public parks or misuse our public facilities. We shouldn't waste those resources. It would even help the church if we participated in community projects and functions. Why? Because we want them to see us. I guarantee you the way that you folks are, I've been around you for 6 months, the way you are would be instantly recognizable by people in community project settings. They're different. Why? I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. They're kind. They love people. They really serve people. They really care. And we must refrain from neighborhood gossip. Why would you put something like that? I've come to find out in neighborhood gossip that our neighbors are not looking to resolve conflict. They're looking to gain other neighbors to their side. And it would really make them happy if you would isolate from the neighbor they're talking about too. Show them that they're wrong instead of resolving conflict. Neighborhood gossip is not aimed at resolving conflict. And this is nothing new. When we do not have a purpose or we not have something constructive to do in our lives, that's what we do. How do you know that? 1 Timothy 5:13. He was talking about young widows. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. We haven't changed. When we don't have a purpose, when we don't have a focus on spiritual things to remind us that's not the way we act, and that's what we engage in. Psalm 15, 1 through 3, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle, who may dwell in your holy hill. This is the person that can do that. He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. There is a way we're expected to act in the community. These behaviors have never successfully built a community, but they've divided and torn down plenty. I hope that you guys have never had to be in neighborhood disputes or neighbors that were so hateful and so selfish that they were a menace to be around. We've had neighbors like that. And we always prayed and tried to be able to do the right thing, to be able to make the connection to where progress could be made. If we'll do it to a neighbor, then we'll eventually do it to someone in the church. And that should not be so. It shouldn't be so. We should prefer one another. We need to think of subtle ways to serve our neighbors for no other reason than to be kind. I read something the other day. Somebody said it was 7 o'clock in the morning. They heard their neighbor's lawnmower going off. They were furious. They didn't have a good night's sleep. They needed to get some sleep, and they're frustrated and peeks out the windows, and the neighbor had mowed her yard too. We think differently about those things, right? And what would our neighbors think about with us if we did something like that? It may be pulling in their trash cans. Something small that affects the way that they think about us. Even if we've had a rocky past, we don't return evil for evil. We must keep our children under control. That's kind of interesting to put up there, isn't it? Proverbs 17:25, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. That's inspired writings. The neighborhood should take notice that our kids are different from the average kid, that they're respectful, especially to the elderly, to the local authorities, and other people's property. They should be able to do that, because if they notice that our kids are not respectful to the elderly or the local authorities or the other people's properties, then what happens? Is it just that kid? It's the whole family that gets pulled into that. And if the family is known to be associated with the church, then it's the whole church. They're not interested in that, in raising their kids properly. If they're lazy, if they see these children out working in the yard with their parents, or maybe even helping a neighbor take in their groceries and things like that, it matters. If they even help their dad fix the neighbor's flat tire or deliver groceries for a widow, those things should be manufactured in our lives. So we have to intentionally think about doing good. They're honest and quiet when appropriate, and these actions reflect on the child, but who else do they also reflect on? The parent. They do. My mom used to tell us that all the time. We were bad kids. There were 4 boys, and we were always in trouble. We didn't care about other people's property. We didn't know about property lines and boundaries and things of that nature. We did what we want. And my mom and dad will always talk about that. What you do reflects on me. Well, as a child, there wasn't anything to back up that bad behavior to correct it or anything, so we would continue to do it. And it's not until you get older that you realize that what I read in Proverbs is true, that you were grief to your father and bitterness to her who bore him. Parents don't want to deal with that, especially if they're trying to teach. But if they teach without correction, then it's not going to go very far. This is my honest opinion, and I'm talking about kids that aren't even able to drive yet. They have too much authority in the home. Parents give them too many choices. They don't get a choice about whether they come to church or not if they live in my home. They don't. And they're going to grow up to hate the church. No, they're not. They're going to grow up to see the value that mom and dad had in the church. They don't. If they live in my home, they do not get the decision to decide whether they're going to come or not. Yeah, but I want them to. They will. They will. If you believe that the power is in the Word and not in the preacher or not in the elders or not even you as in parents, but it's in the Word, they will. They will. But you have to create the value. The home must be peaceful. If the police are at your house frequently to resolve disputes or neighborhood disruptions, then we're not doing it right. Right? I think that's extreme and obvious, but there are congregations that have problems with that, where the husband and wife are publicly disruptive in their neighborhood. If neighbors have to call the police over boundary disputes, like you're putting in a fence, or noise complaints, or your dogs roaming the neighborhood, then you're not promoting peace. And that is part of this in the community. Husband, wife, and children should all know how to communicate, even in conflict, peacefully in the home. Proverbs 17:1, listen to the wisdom. Better is a dry morsel with quietness than a house full of feasting with strife. And I think we would all agree with that, wouldn't we? Nobody likes a home that's turned upside down by emotions and lack of restraint. Return good for evil. It's not just good for good, evil for evil, right? Because we shouldn't do that, but return good for evil. Do not cut off relationships in the neighborhood over minor matters. Practice the second mile religion, right? We do what's unexpected and more. He said you go with that Roman soldier a mile and then go another mile more. What was the law? The law was if he compelled you, you had to do 1 mile. But what do you think the Roman soldier thought of the man that they get to the end of the mile and he says, I'll do 1 more? Blown away. Do you not think that our neighbors and people that we interact with in the community are the same way? I guarantee you are, and you probably all have stories where you had a second mile thing that you did, and the reaction of the person that you did it to, they were blown away, because that doesn't happen. Maybe they gave you the wrong amount of change and you returned the change back to the cashier, and most of the time, what do they say? Wow, that never happens. That's second mile religion, and it does matter. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. So this is not just in the household of faith. If it is possible, as much depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Romans 12, 17, and 18. Who did it depend on? It said, if it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. The other thing I have up there is we must watch our speech. Colossians 4:6, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Developing a long fuse will help us stay away from bad speech. And it is something that happens over time. If you would categorize yourself as somebody that's short-tempered, you can work on lengthening your fuse. You have to. If you realize that a Christian has to have influence in the community, you have to. Developing a long fuse will help. Anger makes us say things before we have a chance to filter or edit them. You ever thought about that? Cursing, dirty jokes, racist jokes, idle words, being overly critical of people will damage your influence in the community and bring reproach on the church. That's a sin, and it needs to be repented of. It does. Do you realize that you can be overly critical and talk about people so much that when they walk away, you know what they think to themselves? Man, he talks about everybody. I know that he will talk about me when I walk away. Because if you don't think that that person will, you don't know that person. If they're talking about everybody else you know when they're with you, when you leave, they pick up talking about you. We should never be those people. If the only exercise you get is running people down and jumping to conclusions, I'll help you find a gym. Because that shouldn't be your only exercise. All right, the first century example. In Acts 26, 46, and 47, really it is that last portion of Acts 2 that gives us the example of the first century church about being an influence in their community. It sums up their influence and the result. It says, so continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. Isn't that whole summary statement there talking about the way we should be? It talks about being daily. It talks about being house to house. It talks about spreading the word. That's it. We have in 2 verses the summary of the way the church should influence the community. How did they do that? They were steadfast and worshipful. There's no such thing as a part-time Christian. You guys have heard me say that before. No such thing. You either are or you are not. They were steadfast in worship. In Acts 2:42, it said they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrines, teachings. Well, if they're the apostles' teachings given by the Holy Spirit, they're God's teachings. It's not their personal opinion that they molded into a package to deliver around Jerusalem. It said they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and in fellowship and in breaking of bread and in prayers. I guarantee you that your neighbors know what time services are. Every Sunday, every Wednesday, every Sunday night, you leave at the same time. And you're dressed in a way that doesn't say, I'm going to mow the yard. They know. And so if the world attends on Sunday morning, you know they recognize and admire someone they meet that attends Sunday evening and Wednesday. They know. I want them to ask me why. Why do you go so much? That's the question. Just by my attendance, I'm hoping my neighbors will ask me, why do you go so much? Why? It's a conversation. We're headed toward a Bible study. They've asked me something that they want an answer from that has to do with spiritual things. And I would gladly take that every day. What else about the first century church? They were united. Acts 2:44, now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need. Now it continued in Acts 4:32. Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they all had things in common. This is not a command, right? That's why we all have our own homes and we do have our own possessions. It was a mindset. They sold the things that they had to meet the needs of the foreigners who stayed in Jerusalem and needed to be served. That's why they did that. And so if you have communist or socialist friends that are trying to use Acts 4 as a way for us all to be in some socialist commune, that's not at all what happened. Ephesians 4, 3 through 6, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And there must be a standard for that to happen. We have the New Testament. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all, through all, and in you all. Togetherness. See, yeah, yeah. But it proves it, right? It's different. People are always watching. They're taking inventory in. And maybe someday you'll have a conversation with him about why he shouldn't drink. And that's what the goal is. It's not, oh, that guy drinks, I'm going to stay away from him. It's how do we now influence or impact him? The first century was benevolent, right? We've already seen that. There was nothing off limits of their possessions that they were not willing to use to help someone else. That's the mindset for us. Not that we have to sell everything that we had. They were happy. You know, I remember taking over a less than happy workplace in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a Lowe's. And I went back to visit the lady that takes all the broken returns and things that we refund because they were done, you know. And she, first day, she looks at me, why are you smiling? Because I'm happy. I got a good job and can't wait to get in here and work with these folks and try to help them become better and happy and enjoy their job and all that. She said, you won't be smiling like that in a month. I said, why is that? This place will eat you up. There's no store managers that last more than a year and a half, 2 years here. You won't be smiling in a month. So I walked over to her desk. She had a big desk calendar on it, and I circled that 30th day. I'll come back and see you. Look, I already know. I've been in retail for 25 years. I know this smile's not going anywhere. 30 days, came back. She couldn't believe it, start to affect and break her, right? We need to be able to do that. She thought my happiness depended on my job or the morale of the associates that I managed. No, ma'am. You're wrong about that. That's why the smile didn't go away. Did I have tough days at work? Yes. Was she some of those tough days? Yes. But by the end of that, we were having discussions. She wanted to know where the church was around where she lived. My happiness depends on my state, and my state is I'm a Christian, and I rejoice in the Lord. And because I rejoice in the Lord, He'll allow me to rejoice in my job, whether people are happy or not. The first century was zealous evangelists. Acts 5:42, it said, daily in the temple and in every house, they did not cease teaching and preaching the Lord Jesus Christ. Acts 8:4, it says, they went everywhere preaching the word. Wherever I go, I'm a Christian. Anywhere in the community. It's not being weird or street preaching every day. It's not trying to become an outcast and then people go, oh yeah, I know that guy. It's taking advantage of the relationships that we have or will have. That's what being an influence in our community is. The first century church prayed, right? Paul would say, pray without ceasing, 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Paul would say the last thing is that they loved one another. And the community saw that, but it was Jesus who was the key. Jesus was the key. The world knows how we treat each other, so we don't bash brethren. I don't care what their life is like. You never bash the brethren of the Midtown Church of Christ to anybody in the community. I don't care what it is. Even if they're in some kind of egregious sin against the entire community or the state of Victoria, I don't care. Because they have a Savior that can wash them with His blood. Do not put the preacher down. Do not talk about her leaders in a bad way. We have to give each other the benefit of the doubt. And it's one of the most difficult things that human beings have to do day after day, person after person, is give people the benefit of the doubt. We need to seek resolution when we hurt each other. And if there's any of us that carries grudges or hurt or misunderstandings, we need to talk about it. And the phrase I always gave my associates when conflict was going on in the store, I said, look, I know that I'm asking you to do a very courageous thing, but I want you to walk up to that associate when you guys are in the break room or something like that and say, somewhere along the way, we got off on the wrong foot. And what I'm asking you is, can we hit the reset button? And then they had a conversation. Sometimes they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't go and do that. But do you ever think the conflict was resolved? No. But the ones that would take the advice and have the courage and the right heart of wanting to do the right thing would always say, you know, somewhere along the way, we got off track with each other. I just want to hit the reset button. And then that just lets that other person relax and be comfortable, and then there can be conflict resolution, and I move on. Isn't that the way you think people should do it? Then the last, we'll run out of time, but the last is recognizing the opportunities. There's congregational efforts. Some congregations have them more than others, but with ours, if there are gospel meetings, there's a vacation Bible school during the summer, guest speakers, marriage seminars, workshops, whatever they be, all of them are opportunities for us to invite the community into this community of believers to show them who we really are. And I'm telling you, it is instantaneous when the world comes into this assembly. I'm talking specifically about the people that I know at Midtown, that they say, wow, those people are really friendly. They are really kind. They act like they've known you for 10 years. Those are things I've heard from people that have come into this assembly. And that's why we need all these opportunities for us to take advantage and bring our friends and family members into them. Wasn't it Philip that said to Nathanael, come and see? Where was he bringing him? Does anybody remember? Where was Philip bringing Nathanael when he said, come and see? To Jesus. Come and see Jesus. We found the Christ. And that's the same way that we should be. Cornelius gathered a house full to listen to Peter, didn't he? He had the vision. He says, you send for Peter. Peter's going to come. And when Peter's there, Cornelius had been busy while Peter was on his way. He gathered his household in to listen to the gospel. The Philippian jailer and Lydia both. They weren't the only ones in those accounts that were baptized. It said Lydia and her household. It said the Philippian jailer and his household were converted to the Lord. Times when people are sick or diagnosed with serious illness, that's a time for us. When people have a death in the family, that's the time for us. When people have graduations and weddings, now we're on to the good stuff, graduations and weddings and promotions that occur, showing care and rejoicing with those that rejoice is an excellent time for us to show Christian influence in the community. When disaster strikes in the community, weather-related destruction, people without power. You know, I wrote this, a couple of weeks ago. I didn't know what was going to happen with the Guadalupe flooding and things like that. But the churches in that area, if they're not actively involved in search and rescue and getting people a place to stay and clothes and things like that, they are missing an opportunity to be an influence in the community. And so when any of these things happen, we need to be thinking about that. You know, it reminds me of something that we have and are praying and are keeping up with. And when these types of things happen in these lives, we need to know about it. So the compassion cards can start, so the visits can be made to where we can show them that we care about them as an individual. And what I know from being involved with the congregations that do that program on a regular basis, you will get visits from those people. They've never seen anything like it. And in most cases, their pastor or their preacher or their church members, they're not coming to see them. But the church did in force. Communities should be better because Christians are there. If everyone in the community were just like me, what kind of community would I live in? Would I move there? If everybody in the community were just like me, would I move into that community? What do you think the city of Nazareth was like when Jesus and his family were living there? I can only imagine. that it probably had a pretty good reputation. And what kind of city do you think Bethany was, where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived? And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. That's John 11:19. What that tells me is that Martha and Mary were such a good influence in their community. When their brother died and they were hurting, it says many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary. What a beautiful thing. The bell means be quiet. Appreciate your time and attention.